To introduce him, I suppose, he wrote probably the pinnacle book on the Nally family. A couple of you guys are from the Nally family, so he's the expert on the Nallys. He knows everything about you guys. So he's going to give a talk about the early pioneers and the relationship between the priests and the laity. So I think it's going to be very exciting. I learn something new every time I talk with him. I remember we were just walking around Holy Cross and he was pointing out all the history. I was like, I didn't know that at all. So I think you guys are going to enjoy this. So Joseph, you can come right on up.
Thank you. Just gave me all those accolades about being the Nally expert, and you told me the name of your grandpa, and I looked at you like a deer in the headlights. But that book only went 7 generations, and I'll bet he was 8th generation, and that's why I got an excuse there. I drew the line, and you were on the other side. Kind of interesting, Michael, you're talking about anniversaries and jubilees, is that I'm writing a book right now on the earliest Catholics who got here by statehood. Was anyone at that Holy Cross event? Not last August or September, but the year before. That building was 200 years old, built by Father Nerics. You know, the current Holy Cross Church. You know, it says 1823 on there. So in 2023, there was an event. They had a mass, they had a dinner, and I spoke at that. And I was just at that point saying, you know, I've been doing research on this, which is why Father Gooden asked me to speak. And I said, well, maybe I'll write a book. I've been doing this research. I'm not sure if it'll end up being a book. And here I am a year and a half later, and I'm still doing research. I've started to write, but really I'm still doing research. And the problem is not a lack of history and documents in this place. It's that there's too much, which is a great gift for somebody who's doing research and wants to dig back into the past. And I wanted to have that book out this summer because this summer is the 240th anniversary of Basil, or some people say Basil Hayden, you know, leading that first Catholic group from Maryland out to Kentucky. And I thought that would be great. And it's also the more or less 140-year anniversary of Webb wrote that book on the 100 Years of Catholicity in Kentucky. Are you all familiar with that book? Or I brought a copy of it if anyone is not, just to look at it. And so, but it doesn't look like, because of that comment I made about there's too much stuff out there, too many notes, too much history, too many archives. There's just no way I'm going to get it done and get it done well. So it'll probably be closer to next year. But in as a side, kind of a little tangent of that research, just recently I thought, you know what, I need to connect with the Archdiocese of Baltimore and the Archdiocese here in their archives and see what they have from the priests and others writing notes back to Baltimore in the early days. And so, you know, we're talking about really pre-Flagey. So he got here in 1810, if I recall that. And so there were a lot of notes or letters written back and forth. And you know it wasn't a quickie. It was a month trip. So someone had to carry these letters, and they had to wait for someone to be going to Maryland, and then they had to give it to them and hope they got there. And then sometimes they didn't. And then the same thing coming back. So it was minimum 2 months to get an exchange. Just crazy to think about in our day and age. But I found out that, this is my count, I may be wrong on this, that Father Badin wrote 72 letters to Bishop Carroll. And I was able to get 70 of them, which was great. The other 2 I'll let go. And I've just recently, about a week ago, finished reading them all. And I thought, you know, this is great because this man struggled. Some of you know the story. Some of you know he wasn't liked by certain people. And he was loved by certain others. I'd say, for the most part today, we love those who know something about Father Badin. That, you know, he's called the Apostle to Kentucky, among others, but he's probably the number 1 apostle to Kentucky. And I'll tell you, after I read all his comments back, because he was getting comments from the bishop in Baltimore, Bishop John Carroll, sending him notes saying, I'm getting notes from the laity about you. Explain yourself on this topic, and this topic. And he was just being, I don't know what the word is, he was just being fair or judicial. It wasn't like he had an axe to grind with Father Badin. He was so grateful he was out here, and he was so steady. But I read it, and at the very end I thought, I wouldn't have stuck around if I were in his shoes. This was just, it was absolutely brutal. It was hard enough just doing the work, right? He had stations all over. I don't know if any of you have ever seen that map he drew. Among his letters about 1806, I'm thinking, maybe a little earlier, he sent a map to John Carroll, like, let me explain this to you. Here are the main streets. I and any other priest who might have been there. Here's where we're going, and so he's got Harding County, that's St. John's, that parish out there. St. Clair's well, that's Boulder County. St. Clair's in Hardin County, but he was going out to Breckenridge County. He was going as far away as Mason County, Maysville. He was over. He had to regularly go over to Madison County, so we're talking, that's Richmond, Eastern University, Berea. That's all Madison County. He was out there. I think I've got that geography right. He was going to Vincennes on occasion. You know where that is. He went to Nashville, I think, twice, and Knoxville once. I mean, he was all over the place. And then what happened was he was getting complaints, but his workload was too heavy. It was an overly demanding situation. He was serving above and beyond what he thought probably he had to be doing when he got here. And it was just physically demanding. You probably all heard the stories of these priests who were kind of itinerant. They were just all over the place. They'd get on their horse and travel sometimes at night. And Father Badin, had an outlet because he often didn't have another fellow priest who could talk to. And when he did, that priest was gone when he was here, or vice versa. They hardly saw each other. And I think there was a time where I think Nerings was living with him at, Loretto Mother Houses where he lived. He had a place called St. Stephen's, or Priestland it was called. And that whole property was basically his at that time. And he said, he wrote to Bishop Carroll, Father Nerings lives with me. Well, I guess. I haven't seen him in 6 weeks, that kind of thing. And it's his roommate. And so these guys were just workhorses. And, out of appreciation, they got a lot of, I want to call them parishioners, but I don't know if they really had parishes then like we think of them now. But the parishioners, the congregants were sometimes brutal. And it seemed like, for the most part, going through his letters, because he put names out there, and a number of them, quite a few of them, are on my list of who were the original Maryland, Catholics, not just Maryland, who were the original Catholics who were here by statehood. That's my book. Stop at 1792, which Catholics were here. And I have 365 families here by the end of the year 1792. And there was a group, I don't know what I'd say, 6 to 9, mostly men, a couple women, mostly men who were, I would say, outspoken and influential members of their settlements, right? They were called settlements back then. And they, for whatever reason, just gave him a hard time. And at one point he had a comment, I'm going to try to recall what I don't have it written down. He said, where does Mr. X get his information? Because it was basically some gossip that wasn't true about him, about Father Badin. And so he was traveling all over. I'm sure he had plenty of time to think about this stuff, because when he wrote when he would write his letters to Bishop Carroll, he would go on and on. One of them's 36 pages, handwritten, and it wasn't large, cursive. It was kind of small because paper was expensive and hard to come by. And many of them, he said, "I'm going to stop writing. It's midnight." And he probably got up at 4 a.m. Just because he was hard on himself as well with his regiment and his morning prayer. And I know there were lots of times where those priests were doing their divine office, the liturgy, they were doing that on the saddle while they were passing along wherever. And so it was a really tough adventure, a tough life. And he I just have grown so much in admiration of him because he stuck it out. And you know the first priest who was here, does anyone know his name? The first priest who was sent to this area. Anyone recall that? That he was a Franciscan Capuchin. Father
David?
He was an early one. He came with Bishop Flagey, so he was a little later.
Okay.
But yeah, Father Whalen. Whalen, and he was the priest. He was Irish.
Charles Whalen,
Charles Whalen.
1787.
That's when he got here. Yep, in the fall. And yeah, I had to do a lot of research to figure out when he got here, because there's a whole variety. If you read Webb's book, you'll find about 4 different dates for when he got here. But that's Webb. So he got here, and he had a salary drawn up for him. There were those groups were coming out once a year, 20, 25 groups of them coming, down the Ohio in flatboats. And the group that wanted to go there to come out in 1787 went to the bishop right at the beginning of the year, January of that year, and said, "We want a priest." And he goes, "I've got one for you." And he said, "But you guys are going to have to support him." And they, sure, here, draw up. So they got the paperwork and signed a document, and they promised to pay him £100 a year for 3 years. Now, £100, I don't know if that sounds like a lot, but it's the equivalent of a salary of probably $9,000 or $10,000 a year now. But for Kentuckians in back then, it might as well have been $100,000. It didn't matter. They were poor. There wasn't a lot of cash. The agreement said they'd pay in gold or silver coins. They didn't have them. And so Father Whalen made the mistake of suing them. And he initiated it. And then he made some comment that one of them didn't like. This is going to be explained in my book, but that person sued him back. And that didn't go well. And he took off. He basically snuck out in the middle of the night. One of the pioneers used the word eloped. And eloped back then had nothing to do with marriage. It just meant he snuck out in the night. He just left. And then the next priest was a priest by the name of de Rowan. Rowan's Knob. He owned that land. And so that he came out and he had some problems. He liked his whiskey a little too much, and he would go in and out of bouts with that issue. And then he also did not have he didn't have full faculties, permission from the ordinary, the bishop, the boss, to do everything. He wasn't supposed to hear confessions and certain things, and he was doing them, and they had to kind of straighten him out. And so he did these baptisms that weren't proper. He did weddings that weren't proper. They weren't up to form, lacking in form, we might say, in the Catholic Church. And I'll give you an example. The deacon will love this one. You could tell me what's wrong with this. He was baptizing, and Badin explains this in one of his letters to the bishop. He has 3 babies he's baptizing. And he gets the water. I'm assuming he's got a pitcher or something. And he says, "Baby 1, I baptize you in the name of the Father. Baby 2, in the name of the Son. Baby 3, in the name of the Holy Spirit." And lack of form or improper form. That's not a legal, a proper baptism. And so poor Badin had to go around and fix this guy's mistakes. And by this time, they had kind of removed him. He said, "You're not really stable for ministry." So he went off and taught. And so Father Badin had to kind of clean up. And I think there's some humor at 200 and whatever years later now. I think there's some humor in this, but he went to some couples and said, I don't know how many, let's say 20 couples that you were married and it wasn't a proper marriage, so I'm going to have to redo the marriage. Well, 2 of the couples said, "We're not married properly. Well, things aren't going really well in our marriage," and they split, and they took that as like, "Really?" And it wasn't even an annulment. They'd say, and so they never stayed married. And they said, "Oh, we're not married?" And those of you who are married know, every now and then you have those thoughts like, "Why did I marry this person?" And they were probably in that point, they didn't give it a long enough time. But Stephen Theodore Badin, in his vocation, in his career, he gave it good time. I mean, he stuck in there. he convinced Father Nerix not to leave. He convinced Father Fournier was one of the priests. He actually built the little priest house out at St. Mary's in Calgary, the Rolling Fork community. He was a fellow Frenchman with Badin, and he was ready to leave himself. And Badin convinced these folks to stay. It's like, you kidding? I would have said, let's both leave if I were in his shoes. It was pretty bad. So he labeled the worst communities. The first one, he said, was the one out in Scott County. Anyone know about the Scott County crowd? There was that group of, pardon? St. Francis de Sales. I was out there several months ago, and it was kind of nice, actually. That's the second oldest parish in the state. And I was out there, and I walked up there in the middle of the day on a weekday, and it was open, and I went in and prayed, and the church, the graveyard that is across the street. It was kind of nice. And they were a rough crowd. They were the group that said, yeah, I know we've got this kind of contracted group of us who are coming from Maryland, going to Kentucky, and yeah, you guys are supposed to be going all to the Pottinger's Creek or Holy Cross Settlement. And some of them decided not to do it. We're gonna stay here. We like the land out there better, and it is better land. But they were already kind of had this rebel attitude, and it was really hard for the priest out there and for Father Badin. And he wrote the bishop saying, I'm struggling with that community out there. It's just a tough community. They just don't want to work with us. And he said something like, I have been out there 4 times in the last 6 months. That's on a horse, that's a little bit of a haul. I mean, we could get there in an hour and 10 minutes or 20 minutes, but 70 miles or so on a horse. It was at least 2 days. If the weather was bad, maybe 3. And he was out there, and he's supposed to be, helping people out, and people out here who were dying, and he couldn't give them, what we called them, right, extreme unction, last rites. But he's having to deal with this congregation, and the problem was this trusteeism. Who's heard that word in church circles? Trusteeism or trustees. Protestants in this crowd, you probably know that, right? It's in the Catholic Church, who assigns the priests to the parishes? The bishop. But that's not the case in a lot of the Protestant churches. The congregation forms, they own as a group of trustees, they're like board of directors, right? They own the land, the church, and they hire the pastor that they like. And if they don't like his preaching, or he said something they don't like, well, you no longer have a job. Let's put a job application or a job posting out there and get someone else. So the Catholics were so suppressed in this country, in wherever they came from, because there were some here who came from Pennsylvania and a few Catholics from Virginia, but they mostly had left Maryland, gone to Virginia, and came here. But mostly Maryland. But they weren't so used to that model. They were looking at Protestants around them and saying, well, that's how they do it, and we want to be able to pick our own priest and buy the land and own the land. And they didn't want Badin to own it. They saw him as kind of like a business threat. Hey, we want to own that land, and we're going to buy 100 acres with it, and we'll lease that out and farm it and make some money that way to help pay for the church and all that. And Bishop Carroll had to write a letter saying, that's not how we work. If the Catholic Church works like that, then we don't have the Catholic Church anymore. And so he struggled with that out there. The second community that he struggled with the most, can you guess? It's more local here. It's in Nelson County. Maybe you've heard this. Gilly Simpson wrote a book about this parish.
St. John?
No, they were good. They were really good. Fairfield, St. Michael's.
St. Michael's.
St. Michael's. And they were kind of known to be kind of the more local in the Kentucky Holy Land rebels out there. And then he said the most virtuous community was the community in Madison County. And there were only like 20 families out there. And it was in, I had to look this up. I had to print out his map. And I actually have, let me show you that. I actually have just a weak copy of it. This is his map that he drew. This is central Kentucky for the bishop from, let me see if the dates here. he wrote it up, he dated it Bardstown. I don't know, I might have cut it off. But I think it's either 1802 or 1806. But I had to look it up. It's way out here in a town called Lancaster, or maybe they say Lancaster. Yeah, and there's a little parish there today called St. William's. It was called St. Christopher then. I'm not sure it's even the same footprint where those two churches were. St. William's is right in town. But so he was going out that far and up to, he was in Frankfurt a number of times, Lexington a number of times. Badin was brilliant. I didn't know this until I read all these 70 letters of his. He was a really bright guy. He picked up on English very well. He wrote really well. I don't know how many times he wrote words. I'm like, what does that mean? I had to go to the dictionary. There were very few times reading those letters where I thought, yeah, I could tell he's a foreign born. And he learned, his first couple letters were in French, actually, and then he went to English, and it was English then on. And the interesting thing is that sometimes those English letters jumped into a paragraph of Latin. I'm like, oh, this he didn't want anyone to know but the bishop. I'm gonna have to translate that. And some of it was a little juicy, but some of that stuff I just kind of kept inside me. I mean, I'm not gonna print anything about that in my book, but he had a really good business sense about him, and he was good with land. And as you know, he had troubles with Bishop Flaget and the land. Has anyone ever heard this? It was Bishop Flaget's biggest thorn in his side. He went to Bishop Carroll. He went to the Pope about it. Father Badin is not signing over all the properties. He was here for like 15 years. He was here for 16 years, I think, before Flaget got here. And he had been buying all the land, and he was kind of brilliant with, I'm using this for collateral over here, and I've got $200 down there. Just to he was always on the edge of bankruptcy, but he managed it. And then Flaget said, hand them all over. He goes, I can't, they're all tied up. Here are my credits on the line. I'll give them all to you, but I need, $400 there and $200 here. Which was a lot of money back then. And Flaget said, can't do it. And then Badin said, I can't either then. And it was just, I think Bishop Flaget, as much as I admire him to death, I think he was a little naive about business sense when he got here, the administrator part of a bishop's, job with the many hats they've got to wear. I just think he needed to learn that. And he got, apparently, according to one of the letters, he got a little bit upset with Badin, and even used some foul language, apparently. We think of Bishop Flaget, and I still do, of him as a very saintly man. And he was a very peaceful man. And people who encountered him, even those who weren't Catholic, found him to be very peaceful, including Anthony Wayne, the general who went up, I think he was a general, right? Went up and kind of handled the last of the Indian wars up in the Ohio area. Met him and was really moved by him. So Badin had to also deal with some threats. People were threatening to leave the faith. And that his job obviously was to keep them in the faith and make them grow in the faith. Ultimately he's trying to save their souls. And there was actually, I found this out recently, you might like this, a Nally woman. It turns out she was the sister. This is Badin's writing about this. He wrote about a lot of people, which is why I read those, because that's what I'm writing on, the people. There was a Nally woman who wanted to marry her first cousin, who was a Spalding. And remember I mentioned to you the three Nally brothers who came out here, Francis, Barnabas, and Raphael. Well, this is a sister, Suzanne. There was another sister, Catherine. And they came out, and she wanted to marry the first cousin, and her mother just got all frustrated because it was on her side of the family that this first cousin came in. She was a Spalding. I just found that out. Their mother was Mary Spalding. I just found that out from Father Badin's records. So that's an addition to my book. So she threatened to, well, I want to marry him. If you don't give me permission, we'll just go to another church. We don't have to be Catholic. And the mother's getting stressed out. He's getting stressed out about this. But he ended up not giving her permission, and they each married someone else and lived happily ever after. So by his comment about who that first cousin was, because he went into a little detail on that Spalding family, I was able to figure out who she was. It's like, thank you. I mean, I wrote that Nally book. I'm like, this is one of my biggest lacks, is that I don't know the mother of these three who came out here. All I know was her name was Mary, and now I found out through Father Badin of all people who she was. So there was a real kind of lack of gratitude on the part of the faithful, and I shouldn't say it that way, on the part of some of the people here who just made life miserable for him and for all the priests, and they were like I said earlier, creating gossip, creating stories, being very critical, writing letters to the bishop. And one of the reasons I went looking for Badin's letters was I also wanted to try to find some of the letters people wrote here to Baltimore, and I have to go out there. I'm trying to avoid making a trip out there to go read some of these letters. But I did see a letter. I did get a copy of a letter that some people from here wrote in his favor. It was actually Badin and Nary, so it was a little bit later, probably 1806 or 7. And one of them was, someone mentioned St. Thomas. You know, Thomas Howard was the donor of that property, hence they named it St. Thomas, and his wife Anne. He wrote a letter with William Coombs, and Coombs he's one of the first Catholics in the state. His wife was the first school teacher. Some of you maybe have read that in the history, the Catholic history. The first doctor was Dr. Hart. Dr. Hart was in the fort at Harrodsburg, and Coombs and his wife opened a school there, and they say she was the first school teacher in this state, and he was the first doctor. Hart owned the land that is now the cemetery, and Coombs owned land that is, I think, I get this confused between those two, but it's lands that goes out kind of northeast toward the bypass. They each have kind of a property that are butted up against each other, and many hundreds of acres. But they were in the fort when it was being attacked by Indians from 1775 onward. I think it was 76 or 77 when the Indians, the Shawnee, made a major attack. And so then they ended up out here. And Coombs and his son and Thomas Howard and one or two others wrote a note to the bishop and said, don't listen to those folks who are writing you letters about Fathers Badin and Narings. They're good men. Those words that they're saying are not of God. I mean, it was very good, but then they get into some really kind of, the harsh things about these people. They didn't say names, so I don't know exactly who they were, but I do know who wrote the letter. So it was nice to see that, at least one letter where they were saying, hey, you're hearing a lot from from these people about Father Badin and Narings. Don't listen to them. Don't listen to them. So the largest community was the Holy Cross Pottingers Creek community, and then later was Cartwright's Creek became the largest out there, St. Rose and St. Anne's, which was the prior parish out there, church, little chapel. So I'm going to just go through, to kind of end here, just some of the things that about Badin, some a little more particulars. He was criticized for his sick calls. So he would get calls. Somebody would come in and say, my grandpa's dying. You need to get out there and anoint him. Last rites. And so Badin would do it, and he'd get out there and he would complain to the bishop, I went out to go anoint this person, and I'm sicker than the person who's supposed to be dying. And my opportunities cost, we would say that in business. My opportunity costs, those aren't his fault. Or that, I had to not say Mass this Sunday at the parish because I was out there anointing someone who did not need it. So he started saying, here's what I want. If you want me to come out and anoint someone, give them extreme unction, I want a note from a doctor saying they're in danger of death. I want a horse so that I don't kill my horse, because if I don't have a horse and I can't afford a new one, I won't be able to go serve people. And I want $1. And he said, it's not for me. It's going to the church to pay for, whatever decoration, whatever the church needs. And they got upset over this. And so any time that there was a request for money, those certain outspoken people would just go ballistic. And they did not like being asked for money. And we've all heard that. Father, don't preach money from the pulpit. Right? But what happened was, in Maryland, the Jesuits were the priests running the show out there. And they got there, there were Jesuits on the Ark and the Dove, those two boats that brought the first settlers to Maryland. They got a bunch of land. They could lease the land. They made money from their produce, etc. So they were self-sufficient. But that wasn't the case out here. These Maryland transplants just didn't get that. They didn't understand, hey, if you want a priest, you're going to have to pay for him. All right, we'll sign right here. We'll pay for him. And then they didn't. So it was tough. So there was that issue. No dancing. That's one of the things a lot of people have heard about, that these early priests had a fit with these dances. And it wasn't so much that they were dancing, that it would involve some alcohol, and then there was late night stuff, and they were up so late drinking they couldn't make mass on Sunday morning, and there was some promiscuity. So at one point, Narrants would walk over and in the middle of the dance, like say this is the dance floor, and you put a chair, and he would pull out his rosary and say, we're not praying, we're not dancing, we're praying. And so there was that, and then his concerns were mass on Sunday or holy days, visiting the confessional regularly, which wasn't happening enough. I don't know how many times in those letters I read where Badin would say, so-and-so has never been to the confessional since I've been out here, that kind of thing. Since he's the only priest, he knows he's not going to another priest. Pray regularly, stop being lazy. Apparently a lot of the men weren't working hard enough, and they were a little lazy, and he's like, well, if you're not going to work, why don't you come help build the church or something? But they didn't do that. Marriage outside the church, I mentioned that. And he was out there saying, you need to treat your slaves better, which was, in those days, a very touchy subject. He said, allow them to be married in the church. Because if they're not married, it's easier to split them up or whatever. But once you start getting families, then it's hard to. Allow them to go to Sunday service, and don't sell them, if you have to sell them, to non-Catholics or to non-Christians. Because the new owner, slaveholder, might not let them go to church. And so he was better with the salary issue. He didn't come out here with any kind of a contract like Father Whalen did about getting paid. And he went, I think, 6 years without getting a penny. How did he survive? I don't know. He bought a lot of those lands for churches with his own money. Where did he get it? I don't know. He didn't come out wealthy. He came out as a seminarian. He was Bishop Carroll's first person he ordained as a priest. He's the first Catholic priest ordained in this country, is Father Badin. And Bishop Carroll was the first bishop of the country. So Father Badin used to he'd sign his letters to him sometimes saying, you're the primi ordinandi from the primi bishop or whatever, first bishop to the first ordained man. He was very proud of that. So he at one point said the very good women of the Pottinger's Creek congregation collected $74, which was a lot of money back then. And they collected it for what? To expense of a priest to come out, to get another priest out here. Because that was one of their big things. We'll get money so that he has money for the trip. And the priest ended up being Father Narrants that they were saving money for. So that was edifying to see that. Some of these times where the bishop had to say, hey, here's what I'm hearing. He wrote him and said, Bishop, if you're not happy with here's my excuse. And he went on ad nauseum. He wrote a lot about here's why I did that you're asking about. And then he said, but if you're not happy with my work and my actions, I can easily remove myself from this sacred ministry. He was kind of free to say that, but also he was on the edge of, I want to quit. He was so close to that. It was kind of like a tough crowd, It's like walking into a UK basketball game wearing a Duke shirt or something. You're not going to get treated, right? And then he said something that really touched me. He said to Bishop Carroll, I think he said it twice. This is so hard. I wish I would never have been ordained. Wow, that's tough. That's tough. So he said a couple other things that were quotes I thought that were humble. Heaven grant that I myself were exempt from reproach. So I mean, there were times where he said, I'm certainly not perfect. I'm a sinner. And he was really good. He had people just attacking him, including another priest who was out at that St. Francis in Scott County community, who was attacking him. Badin was the vicar general, so he's like second in command, right? The vicariously representing the bishop. Out here, he was allowed to do things that the other priests weren't allowed to. That he had to censor that priest for some things he did that were improper, and he basically said, "You are not going to do ministry," which upset the Scott County people because all of a sudden they lost the priest they had tried so hard to get. And he said, I will forgive him from the bottom of my heart, or I already have. He was very good about saying that. I forgive this person and that person for the harm they have done me. And he said, all I want is the furtherance of good religion and church and for the good of their souls. And that was I just thought he was in such a good place for that. And I guess that's it.
But I think we ought to clap. That was a really good thing.
Thank you.